Welcome to Work This Way, a labor and employment podcast. I'm Tina Emerson, here today with Maynard Nexon attorney Jenny Cluverius. Good to see you again, Jenny.
Good to be here, Tina.
Well, today we have an exciting team with us. It is our friends Joan Moore and Mim Munzel from the Arbor Consulting Group. They're a national human resources consulting firm specializing in HR risk management and regulatory affirmative action compliance. Joan and Mim, thanks for being here today.
We're happy to be here.
Glad to see you. The last time you joined us, we had a great conversation about the fundamentals of federal contracting and the associated risks. So today we're going to talk about compensation and its associated compliance risks. Joan, can you start us off by first explaining why we care about pay?
Well, we have to care because we always have to be worried about potential pay discrimination violations or charges, both from the OFCCP and the EEOC. Both those agencies are very concerned about pay discrimination. In fact, they're convinced it's happening and are kind of determined to determine if you have any pay discrimination. It can get pretty serious with both agencies because if they have a finding of pay discrimination, then there will be back pay awards, compounding interest. It can get pretty expensive pretty fast. There also are various states that are getting into the game, so to speak. California and Illinois both require annual pay reports to be sent into them, and they'll also be analyzing them and following up with questions. There also is always litigation. You may have individual employees feeling they're paid unfairly and filing charges against you. You can also have some of the platforms where employees get to complain about their companies, like Glassdoor. And so you don't want a lot of negative reviews about compensation on those. And then it also can have a great impact on morale. People feel they're not paid fairly, then it's going to kind of sour them on the company, and that can lead to hiring and retention problems. We also find if the OFCCP and the EEOC think there is pay discrimination and go against a company for them, they may send out press releases saying that your company discriminates against its employees for pay, and then again, that cycles through for a retention and hiring issue for you. You don't want that against your brand.
So ladies, I know we've all been through several audits together, and pay is always something that comes up with the OFCCP as we're discussing today. Can you tell us, and I'm anticipating some of your answers based on our prior work together, but what are the potential risks in an OFCCP audit when it comes to pay?
Sure. I'll take that one, Jenny. One of the primary risks that we work very hard to avoid is the OFCCP having any sort of idea that you have too many pay differences that are not explained, because where they leap then is to a conclusion that you have systemic discrimination. And at that point, you are digging yourself out of a really deep hole. So we work very hard to avoid that. Another thing is that they may come back and say to you, we have found indicators. Now, I'm putting that in quotes because it really doesn't mean anything. It just means that they want to ask you some more questions about your pay. But if there's a lot of those, your audit can be more expensive, can take more time. And, it may mean that you didn't put the time in up front to prepare your compensation response so that you can avoid some of those questions on the back end. And we use this phrase a lot, pay now or pay later. And I don't mean, there's no pun intended there. It really just means get your act together and submit something that's really good on the front end. Compensation tells a story. And so you want the story to represent the fact that you're paying people in a non-discriminatory, job-related way, and that you can explain any pay differences that do exist. It's not that you can't have differences. It's the fact that you have to be able to explain them, and you've got to have documentation that supports that. And that's really the fourth risk, is what kind of shape are your records in? So if you're going to say that, we made a pay decision and it was based on, this person had X, Y, and Z extra experience, and that is all relevant and so forth, you got to be able to prove those assertions that you're making.
They better have the records.
They better have the record.
The documentation, definitely.
And very difficult to create that after the fact. It's better to do it as you're going along in anticipation of a potential audit or questions.
That's right.
Yeah.
And with all the data that you've collected in audits, do you see any common practices that might worry you a little?
We see several, actually, that worry us a little bit. That's why we always want to look at it first before the auditor looks at everything. We'll see in some companies where they'll try to have like forced ranking. They'll try to jam everybody into a bell-shaped curve. That cannot be defensible in many cases to do that. Or what are you ranking people on? Is that job-related, non-discriminatory? You might not have the same factors for every single job. And so that can be difficult to defend. It makes it look like you have a system, but it may not be a defensible system. We also have companies say, well, we pay for our values type of thing, or we pay for performance. Well, guess what? You don't really. We've looked at a lot of different systems on our clients. Performance may be one factor, but there are a lot of other ones that you're paying for that you as an organization may not realize. So that's where it's good to do some kind of pay equity review so you don't have surprises when you get to the auditor. We also have inconsistent practices that happen. So you get the hard graders in one department and the easy graders in another, and they're not consistently giving out the merit increases or the pay increases and so on. And that's HR's job to really look across the organization and make sure you have consistency in both the performance reviews and if pay is resulting from any kind of performance review. They'll say, well, this person negotiated their pay better. Well, a lot of states are looking at that now and saying you can't use that, they'll look at prior history and say, well, this person wasn't making as much prior. Again, many states have outlawed that, and that is not a defensible, that's not job-related, non-discriminatory reason for people to be paid differently. Another thing that happens is people say, I have to hire this person, and they're expecting this much money. They're a unicorn. There's nobody else like them. I have to bring them in. Well, fine, you can bring them in, but you have to equalize the pay of everyone else against, again, those non-discriminatory factors that you have. And so there can be a lot of those types of issues. One we also see is with the merger and acquisition situation. There's some kind of urban legend out there that says you have several years to equalize pay with all these merged or acquired companies. You don't. You have to start doing that immediately. And so these are some of the things that we see that get companies into trouble.
So if an organization wants to check and see how they are positioned with respect to pay equity, what would you all recommend they do?
So the first thing they do is they call Maynard Nexon because we want this done under attorney-client privilege. Yeah. Because we don't know what we're going to find, okay?
Protect the bodies that may be dug up during the course of the audit. Yes, right. Yes. Exactly. Keep it under the cloak of privilege.
You want a robust record retention system. You've got to have the records. We talked about that. You want to digitize some key data. So, we see a lot of different HRIS data, and some of it is pretty detailed as far as what records are kept, and other is just not.
Nothing.
So you want to know, for example, somebody's hire date, and believe it or not, that needs to be a consistent definition of what you mean by hire date. The second thing that's really helpful in a pay analysis is time in position. So when did they enter the job that they're in? And that's a record that not a lot of companies keep, but it's a really good one to have because, if somebody is a kind of long-term in the position, you would expect them, and it would be defensible perhaps that you could pay them more than someone who just entered the job. So that's really helpful. You would want to perform an equity analysis and run the compensation data through, some sort of statistical testing. And that all depends on the size of the groups that you have. But we would typically look at it by the job groups in the AAP, only because we know the OFCCP will look at it that way. It's not how we would defend the pay. We would do that starting by job title and even going to a lower level, carving out some smaller groups within a job title. And then you'll want to look at a cohort analysis. So a person by person look at I'll just use this example, why is Harry, the male, being paid more than Sally, the female? And do you have the rationale and do you have the records to prove that? And then you want to monitor pay as you go along, so every year you may be looking at part of the organization, or you're monitoring your practices as you go forward. What is your pay setting practice when someone is hired, for example? And if you do find problems, then you've got to have a plan for how you're going to fix them, because then you're sitting on a problem.
Yeah.
And at that point, you've got to take some action.
And when you have to start digging in like that, how do you investigate those pay differences once you've found them?
Yeah, so you'd take a structured approach. So you'd look at kind of the top level, inequity analysis, large grouping. Do you have any problems that pop up that way? And maybe some of your large groups are fine, and you're trying to just prioritize your efforts. So you start with the ones that are not fine. Then you do the cohort analysis, person by person, what's going on. And that involves looking into your system for what data you have that's systematized. Now, if you don't get the answer you want, looking at the systematized data, then I'm turning over to Joan. Yeah.
Well, then you have to try to figure out, is there anything in the personnel file? You have to go to the actual maybe paper personnel files and find out, did this person come with a book of business if they're a salesperson? Did they have special degrees or certifications? Are they one of the 5 people in the country that handles this cybersecurity area? You're looking for what is a distinguishing factor that would justify that pay. Many times after that, you go to the next level where you're talking to the supervisor, the hiring manager. Hopefully they're still there. We do run into problems where they're no longer there. So we're trying to figure out what it is. But what is distinctive about this person? Are they doing a job that's more complex? Sometimes people will have broad generic titles, which are kind of the kiss of death, I got to tell you, in these kinds of audits, because you want the titles to be as specific as possible. What distinguishes this person from that person? And so many times when we say, well, these 2 people are being paid differently, but they have the same title, the supervisor will say, oh, well, they're working with much more complex situations, or they're doing international work, and this title person is only doing domestic work. You need to know about those kind of differences. And then you get into, okay, decision time. Do we have to make a pay change or adjustment? Do not wait. Again, As soon as you find a problem, do not wait. People think, well, I don't want to call attention to the fact that, we weren't paying before and so on and so forth. And we'll wait till our next merit cycle and we'll give do not wait, because if you're going to have back pay and compounding interest attached to that, you want to make that change as soon as possible.
I think that's some very good advice from Joan and also from Mim. And one thing I just wanted to circle back on really quickly was a point that Mim made earlier about the EEOC potentially coming in and investigating pay disparity as a systemic violation. And that is something that I've actually seen an uptick in recently. The EEOC has been very aggressive in that respect. And when the EEOC does take that position, it's coming in and basically looking at all of your pay practices, sometimes for a particular job group, sometimes overall company-wide. And a lot of times, once the EEOC designates an investigation to be a systemic investigation, your alarm bells should be going off. The agency thinks you have discriminated. They've already made that conclusion, and they are treating the investigation as such. So very good advice from Joan and Mim today. And I wanted to ask if either of you have any closing thoughts or words of advice to our listeners.
Yes, we do. One thing, you kind of mentioned the systemic discrimination. Once you get on kind of the bad list, the bad faith employer list with either of these agencies, it is a slippery slope downward. And they will even sometimes call in other agencies because they figure if you have problems in this one area, we better call EPA, we better call OSHA, we better, you don't want to go there. That's for sure. Or if you're using, some of our clients use unvalidated assessments and tests to determine pay. Well, you're looking at potentially a class action lawsuit at that point too. So the other thing we find is that, our clients will say to us, well, we've done external market surveys and we're within those ranges and we match the external market surveys and so on. The government could care less about that. It's all about internal pay equity between people similarly situated. Or we'll hear, well, we're within our broad pay ranges. Too bad. They don't care, or they may have an idea of what's acceptable. I know a lot of companies think, well, we can have a $5,000 difference and so on between similarly situated employees. No, you can't. It's a very narrow range. If they're similarly situated, then you need non-discriminatory job-related reasons why they're paid differently.
Yeah.
And I would note we're talking about specifically about federal contractor kind of clients in today's context. However, I think we would all agree that even in the broader sense, employers who are not necessarily federal contractors also need to be doing pay equity studies and making sure that their pay practices are non-discriminatory, because they are, of course, subject to the jurisdiction many times of the EEOC and a lot of these other federal laws that regulate, equal pay.
Definitely. And when we talk about federal contractors, we also mean federal subcontractors, because the regulations are the same, the compliance issues are the same.
It's an excellent point.
Well, as with everything with employment law and with compensation and employment in general, things are just always more complex than you think they are. So thank you for bringing some clarity to that. We really appreciate it. And what I've learned today is to stay off the bad list. With the agencies.
That's right. If nothing else, that's good. That's good.
Well, we are glad you're both here to help us stay off the bad list. Thank you both for joining us today in our conversation about compensation. We will see you next time on Work This Way.